Greetings and salutations. This is Abe Abdelhadi with The Bitter Truth. Tonight, I'm going to have a monologue, not really a conversation, but I wanted to talk to you about a gentleman named Saul Alinsky. I got an interesting email from a good friend of mine, but before I jump into that, I at least want to talk to you about who Saul Alinsky was. He was the guy who actually invented modern community organizing, and some people would say something snarky about that, and wasn't Obama a community organizer? Yeah, and he was actually pretty good at it until he became a total sellout. But Saul Alinsky, on the other hand, wrote Reveille for Radicals, Rules for Radicals. He was considered a radical socialist. And while this scares some people as communism, just FYI, socialism and communism is not the same. Before I get into all of this, I just want to make that distinction because a lot of folks will sit there and get, terribly precious about communism versus socialism. I heard a lot of things about Bernie Sanders in 2016. Oh, I can't vote for a socialist. And, well, I'll get into that in a second, but we're already a socialist country if you haven't figured that out. Communism, the simple explanation is it's run by the state completely. Everything's run by the state. Industry's run by the state. Human nature is completely ignored. You're expecting to pay a doctor the same as a plumber, and he's just supposed to be fine with it because the state has determined that for the good of the people. And as we all know, human nature is based on moving forward, which is why communism has failed. There has not been a communist regime in more than 30 years in Russia. They've got a McDonald's in Moscow now, so all this Russia scare is kind of hilarious to me. They may not be the most optimal government, but hey, neither are we. China has become a capitalist dictatorship. They are not communist anymore, but they are still a dictatorship. They're probably never going to have a free election ever, but they're still capitalist. But as far as socialism goes, socialism is where government works in conjunction with business, pure and simple. And the easiest example of that is the airports. So for instance, if you like the airports, then you like socialism. If you like police, then you like socialism. If you like public schools, then you like socialism. An airport, again, is a good example because the county, the state, or the city owns the airport. They pay for the maintenance. They take care of everything. And then United or Southwest or whoever basically rents from the airport. They go ahead and they park their planes there and do what they got to do. But the airport maintains everything. And if Southwest or United had to do that, what would then happen is your $200 flight to LA would suddenly become $1,800, and forget going to London for like $900. You'd be probably paying about $3,500 to go to England. Excuse me. So what ends up happening is that's socialism. And capitalism is good when it's a win-win situation. When it's a win, fuck you. For example, the 0.01% basically takes what's not theirs, and at the expense of, say, other countries, other peoples, and the average CEO in this country is making 476 to 1 from the CEO to the worker. In the 60s, it was 8 to 1. So in this country, I like to think of this as and I said this a couple of times already, I may say it again because repetition is the mother of all learning, but we suffered from selective socialism. And selective socialism basically is where we pay for the mistakes of the banks and Wall Street and big pharma and defense and big agriculture. They benefit from selective socialism. Meanwhile, Main Street and the homeowner get screwed on the bad speculations of the big banks. Or for instance, you've got a situation where Goldman Sachs just put out a report that curing disease is a bad business model if you're going to invest in pharmaceutical companies. So that gets really interesting because then we're paying for the fuck you of the big banks and the big industries. We've created a third world austerity for literally half the working population in this country, where you've got 50% of American workers making under $30,000 in a year. 40% of homeless people have jobs. That's something that I want to say again. 40% of homeless people have jobs. They might be able to afford a gym membership so they could take a shower before they go to work. But I've read about these different stories. I just heard one on NPR about a week and a half ago about a gentleman who's got a master's degree, makes about $2,500 a month in San Diego, can barely afford a place to live, was homeless for a while. He found a room. He's probably going to be kicked out of it because the homeowner is selling the house. So anyway, all of that to say that that is not a unique situation. So to get to this Saul Alinsky gentleman, if you don't know who he is, The piece I got sent was an article called Beware the Useful Idiots. And I never read this article before. Written by a gentleman named Garrett Geer, Geer. Looked it up. The writer doesn't exist. This article has never been published in a newspaper. Some guy just wrote it and dummied it up to make it look like a newspaper article. Now, the funny thing about this is when I did some digging on this article, and I'm going to read these little bullet points to you and kind of debate them as we go. But since this guy is not exactly a cool person, it was a lot of fun to do this. But none of these words, none of these tenets are actually attributed to any of the writings or direct quotes of Saul Alinsky. It was just that he was a radical socialist, popular in the 60s and 70s, or 50s rather, through the 70s until he died. And they went ahead and this person went ahead and attributed these words to him that he didn't ever say. So it's interesting that when you see how the media now demonizes the progressive, especially the so-called progressive media, and they'll say something, Bernie was a dreamer, he's a fairy duster, 1.3 trillion in defense. That's a third of our national budget, but hey, that's okay. Bernie's dreaming. He's an idiot. But let's jump into what this article has to say. So I'm going to bypass all the intro stuff in the beginning, but How to Create a Social State by Saul Alinsky, supposedly. There are 8 levels of control that must be obtained before you're able to create a social state. The first is the most important, healthcare. And he gets into control healthcare and you control the people. Now, this is supposed to be the scheme of a social state. If we control healthcare, we control the people. Well, that's what the right says. However, if you look at what we have a right-wing healthcare plan called the ACA. And what it does is it can enslave people still to high contributions. I know a lot of folks who had to pay more for their insurance through the ACA or Obamacare. It also gets into 5-figure copays, not to mention your monthly contribution to pay for this stuff. But now you're getting into 5-figure, 6-figure bankrupting copays, destroying people's lives. People will sit there and they'll say, well, that's anti-business. That's bad for business. That's socialism. Well, let me ask you a question. If you're a 50-life group and you're the owner of that group, and you go ahead and you tell me that you're paying $1.5 million a year for health insurance for your employees, well, if I was to eliminate that cost, the owner of that company who employs 50 people is now saving $1.5 million a year. Not to mention the contribution out of a paycheck that's anywhere from $300 to $1,000 a month, higher in some cases. I know a single mom, good friend of mine, with 3 kids, one with special needs. She works for NPR in Pasadena. She pays about $1,400 a month out of her paycheck for insurance. Now, if we were to eliminate that, gone would be the copays, gone would be the contributions, and since Medicare is about $100 a month, which we're already paying for, this is not an entitlement, by the way. Medicare is what we pay for. We pay about $100 a month. So if that was going to go up to, say, $120 a month, and government kicked in an extra $50 billion a year, because I've read reports in different magazines from Business Week to Forbes, that if the government was going to pay for Medicare for all, it would cost them between $50 and $70 billion a year. And I'm saying, great. We spend $1.3 trillion in defense. How about we make Medicare $120 a month versus $100, and then the government's kick-in would be a little less. But guess what? We have health care for all, and business just got a huge raise. If a 50-life group is paying $1.5 million a year, I'm sure it's a little less the higher up you go in number. But what's a 500-life group paying? $20 million? $13 million? $15 million a year? How many salaries is that? How many raises could be obtained if that was money that was freed up? Let's just say that the business owner didn't free up but maybe 20% of that cash. That's still significant for a workforce. This article then gets into poverty. Increase poverty as high as possible. Poor people are easier to control and will not fight back if you're providing everything for them to live. Well, first of all, the government did increase poverty. They did that by evaporating jobs, demonizing unions. Nissan has 49 plants all over the world, and they're all unionized except for 3. I'll give you a guess to where those 3 are. That's right. They're in the United States of America. So we've done that over the last 40 years by making deals with the devil and allowing companies that do take subsidies from us to evaporate the jobs and send them overseas. This has been going on since 1961. John Kennedy signed in at first to allow 5% of American manufacturing to be done overseas under pressure from big business. And every president, regardless of party, every year up until 1992, when Bill Clinton passed NAFTA, or 93 rather, when he passed NAFTA, all of a sudden, wow, now you have jobs flooding out of this country. And NAFTA was something that George H.W. Bush and Ronald Reagan couldn't get past. Again, another right-wing plan that was made possible by a neoliberal, so-called liberal, who went ahead and put the foot on the gas to just run a car through a plate glass window. Student loans. Now, we've got over $1 trillion in student loan debt. Let me make something very, very clear, because I was hearing this a lot the last election cycle. I'm hearing it a lot this year. I went to college for free. College was free in this country. I went to a place called Cal Poly Pomona, and that's in Pomona, California. I was paying $75 a quarter when I started there. When I graduated, it was $125 a quarter. That school now runs about $5,000 a quarter. So a bachelor's degree now is costing $30,000 to $50,000 for a bachelor's degree that has less value than it did when I got out of school. And meanwhile, these loans, which are designed to last forever, keep people in debt. That is exactly the kind of thing that poverty does, but the government's been doing it. So when the right warns us about the creation of poverty to enslave us, just know that they did it. And we're living literally with third world austerity measures. I've seen reports that, for example, say to end homelessness in this country, it would cost between $20 and $40 billion. Again, 40% of homeless people work. They have jobs. But think about this. And I'm not talking about the type of homeless person that obviously has a mental problem or a drug problem, and they're on the streets in a real way, and they need help in a real way. Treatment, hospitalization, something to that effect. I'm talking about somebody who has a gym membership, lives in his car or her car. They get their kids to school. They take showers at the gym. Then they got to go somewhere, maybe a McDonald's, hang out for the evening for dinner until they can get tired enough to fall asleep and find somewhere safe to sleep. That's 40% of homeless people right now. And $20 to $40 billion to help those folks out. We bailed out Wall Street to the tune of $1 trillion after the crash. And that was the TARP plan by George Bush, enacted by Barack Obama. It was a totally cooperative, in conjunction type of a thing. And that was done without really any questions asked. And nobody asked a question on how to help the homeowner that got screwed on these loans. But we continually do that. Debt, number 3 on this thing, debt. Increase the debt to an unsustainable level. Excuse me. That way, you are able to increase taxes, and this will produce more poverty. Well, who produced the debt? Government. Who just deregulated the banks and passed yet another tax cut to the wealthy? That's right, the government. Defense is 1/3 of a $3 trillion annual budget. We've got a deficit between HUD and the Department of Defense of $21 trillion missing dollars, and no one seems to say boo. Raising taxes on the poor, wiping out the middle class in this country, is basically slavery, and we pay for that mistake. That's the thing that drives me a little bananas with all of this, is people don't even ask any of these major questions. And you're not going to get it from your mainstream media. I mean, I'm not a journalist. I didn't even major in journalism. I'm just reading stuff and talking to people and watching what's going on. And you can get all kinds of news from all kinds of sources now. You don't need to watch Fox or MSNBC to get any of this, what I'm telling you. These numbers are out there. Google something of what I'm saying. Look it up in The Guardian. Look it up on Al Jazeera television or Al Jazeera online, and you'll see what I'm talking about. The other part of this is gun control. Remove the ability to defend themselves from the government. That way you are able to create a police state. I want to make a point here because up until about 2 years ago, I was on board with that. I was on board with the idea of being armed to the teeth. I was on board with the idea that the Second Amendment was designed to prevent the tyranny of the government, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Something that I realized a couple of years back, and I'll tell you a little story that gave me this grand epiphany, was that our rights have been eroded anyway. And if you're worried about guns and worried about our government taking us over, then those of you with an AR-15 or a howitzer or a tank or a stack of hand grenades, I would appreciate it if you would go to the Capitol and get my rights back. Because since Patriot Acts 1 and 2 got signed, and then Obama signed the NDAA, the National Defense Act of America, on New Year's Eve 2011, which is when most of these things get signed, is in the dead of night. That last one was a doozy because that takes away habeas corpus, which means I could be held without charge indefinitely like a Gitmo prisoner. So if we're talking about rights, we don't really have them anymore. They're being doled out to us. They're no longer God-given, if you will, however you want to put that. The example I want to use really quick is what happened in Dallas a couple of years ago. There was a gentleman that showed up there at the Black Lives Matter march and brought a weapon and decided to start shooting cops. Now, I remember watching the footage before that, and Texas, where I live, had just passed open carry. In addition to your concealed carry license, your concealed carry license now allows you to carry a weapon openly. And certain public places can still deny you, like a bar or a church. However, this gentleman started shooting, and I saw a bunch of these guys, leather vests, baseball hats, carrying their rifles on their shoulders. I'm American, marching, whatever. When the shooting started, these guys ran, all of them, taking many police on wild goose chases thinking, this guy's the shooter, that guy's the shooter. Oh my God, you're not the shooter. Oh shit, we got to go get the shooter. Now, none of these guys jumped in front of a family of 5 and said, don't worry, citizens, I will protect you. None of these shooters ran up to the police and said, don't worry, officers, I am here to help you. I'm Batman. I mean, nobody did that. What they did do was they scattered. And so what that taught me in a split second was, for all the John Wayne fantasy Red Dawn crap that we like to buy into in this country, and for the record, Ronald Reagan was not in the military. He made war movies, not the same thing, aiding more to that fantasy. John Wayne didn't fight in a war. Jimmy Stewart did. A lot of guys did. John Wayne did not. But he liked to pretend and talk tough because he was in a war movie. Not the same thing. If you're on the Universal backlot getting shot at and making a movie called Iwo Jima, doesn't mean you were at Iwo Jima. So the idea of protecting your rights and having enough arms to defend yourself, let me tell you what's going to happen. Human nature being what it is, when the over-militarized police force comes down your street with their SWAT teams and their tanks, on orders, by the way, and police are not paid to think, they're paid to do. So when you see them blow up 3 houses next to you, you're going to throw your crap out on the lawn and assume the position, because that's exactly what the fear will do to you. Very few Americans have the guts to stand up to police. The few that do, God bless you. But if you're worried about our rights to own our right to own guns, first of all, no one's trying to talk about taking away guns, just making certain guns illegal. And it works in some countries. We don't even ask why. I get pushback every time I make a statistic statement. Hey, in Sweden, X occurred. Hey, in Australia, they haven't had a mass shooting in 20 years. Well, we can't do that here. Why? Because we can't. Okay. Japan, in 2016, I saw a little film meme online, and they have a country of 127 million people. We have 340 million people. They had 10 homicides by gun. We had 33,000 homicides by gun. 33,000 homicides by gun. Now, let's just say rule out the suicides, because we've got about 70 or 80 suicides a year by gun. 22 of those are veterans. That's another whole topic when I speak to another veteran on my show. But let's just remove 25,000 from that number. You still have 8,000 deaths by gun compared to 10 in Japan. Country roughly half the size of ours. So why is it that we can't even ask how you do it? Hey, how do you do that? Wow, that's great. How do you do that? Not even asking. And just people being offended and angry and calling you a communist and that you're trying to, give your rights away and everything else. It's widely insulting to the intelligence. And at the rate that people are dying, we might want to ask better questions. And again, if you want a better quality of life, you've got to ask a better question. Welfare, number 5 on this list. Welfare, take control of every aspect of their lives, food, housing, and income. Well, we've been gutting welfare while we're fattening up the 0.01%. And this is absolutely asinine, because what we are doing is we are creating a culture and an atmosphere that we're due for rioting. That's what's probably going to have to finally happen. We're stealing in open daylight. As I mentioned, I saw a Goldman Sachs study last week that declared that curing diseases is not a sustainable business model. Actually, in a Goldman Sachs financial report, because they want to invest in more pharmaceutical companies. So if that's the mentality, that we're now stealing in open daylight, and the government just deregulated the banks again, and the Democrats went right along with it. So if you think either one of these people are working for you, and there's a good guy, bad guy narrative, you're sorely mistaken. When FDR became president and started instituting the New Deal, it was interesting that his friends that he had known for a long, long time, his whole life, rich as he was wealthy. Teddy Roosevelt, his cousin, was wealthy. They came from money. FDR's attitude was, and he had said this, that democracy is asset protection, and we've been skimping on the payments. And at this time, in the early 30s, because of the Depression, there was rioting in the streets. There were labor unions getting shot at by guards at companies that they were trying to strike. A lot of stuff was going down like that. And the economist Mark Blythe, he's got a Scottish accent, so it sounds cooler when he says it, but he says that the Hamptons are not a defensible position. They're a low-lying beach. So when they come after you with the pitchforks, you're easy to get at. Now, make no mistake, I'm not talking about a redistribution of wealth. That's a bad phrase, because what that does is it tells people, I'm going to come take your stuff and give it to somebody who didn't earn it. It didn't work for it. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about people who want to work but cannot earn the wages that they used to earn because those jobs have evaporated, so that we can give tax breaks to the wealthy, and they're not paying the same taxes I pay. Why is it fair that IBM or Apple pay 0.005% in taxes because they've got shelters in Lithuania or Ireland? Why is it fair that Walmart does the same thing? They have 30 tax shelters, 30 shell companies in Lithuania that all they do is funnel money for Walmart. Why? Why is it that we operate on a death economy and we operate on greed? We're not doing anything good for the people anymore. And it starts to become evident when you see more and more jobs evaporating in towns, and the only job you can get is a Walmart gig or a Taco Bell gig, where we used to have union jobs. And I understand that, the robotics are coming, and there's a lot that is going to be made obsolete. There's things a good friend of mine likes to call the sunset industries. Some businesses just go away, and I understand that. But why aren't we working to create, say, for example, solar jobs? Obama promised to turn Detroit into a solar mecca. That failed miserably. Didn't even come close. We had one company, Solyndra, and that was mired in scandal. So that was the end of his, quote, solar program. So all of that to say that we honestly need to rethink how we treat the middle class and the poor in this country. Because many of these people, a good majority of them, I've had friends that have been up and down in their lives. I got a good friend of mine lives out in Colorado. doing well now. Just bought a house about 2 years ago and has a great gig now. And but when she was going through divorce and some things were happening, not great, she had to be on WIC for a while just to get some milk and eggs for her kids. Why are we going to begrudge a single mom to feed her kids when she's working? When we make tax cuts for companies and corporations and treat them as people and have them hold sway over our lives. Education. I'm almost done here. Take control of what people read and listen to. Take control of what children learn in school. Isn't that interesting when you think about that, when we look at the mainstream media? When Clinton deregulated communications in 1996, he created an ersatz oligarchy because we suddenly now had the ability, instead of NBC owning one newspaper, now you had a situation where we're in now, we have 6 companies that own everything. And at one point when General Electric owned NBC, which includes CNBC and MSNBC, they fired Phil Donahue for talking about the Iraq War. They fired Ashley Banfield for talking about the Iraq War. They fired Ed Schultz a couple years back because he was trying to cover Bernie Sanders in a real way. And they didn't want to hear it. They were controlling the news feed. I remember when Bernie Sanders got cheated out of the nomination, and I'll say it, and it's not paranoia. It's hilarious that the DNC, I just saw today, is going to sue Russia and sue the Trump campaign. And while they're at it, they're suing the Easter Bunny, Santa Claus, and Jesus. Because, I mean, who the fuck are you kidding? For what? To release already written emails by the perpetrators that tell us that you cheated a viable candidate out of the nomination? Why aren't we investigating the DNC? The election committee in New York admitted that 200,000 voters got evaporated from the voter rolls in New York during the primaries, costing Bernie Sanders New York. And there's 14 states under investigation, the reports of which were supposed to come out at the end of 17. The good it's going to do us now. But look at what happened with education and via the media. And people watch TV. They listen to the news, and it's all the same stuff. What have you been listening to for a year and a half now? Russia. And you know what they've not been able to prove in 2 years? That the Russians actually hacked the election. We've shown that Trump might be involved in felony money laundering, not with the government, but other Russians, which means nothing. There's a lot that's not being shared, but it's being spun. And even our history books, I should stick to education. I kind of drifted off into the media. But even our history books are completely lacking. We're changing words. We're changing stories. We're watering down the slavery story in this country, and all because we are able to, because now we can. And so when you look at gutting the arts, gutting the sciences, that kills cognitive thinking. We're cutting funding, but we're telling teachers to carry guns. We're cutting funding to education. But the big suggestion when a shooting happens is, well, teachers should get guns. Okay, let's break that down for a second. You have teachers already paying for their materials, using books that are falling apart in a lot of states, Oklahoma, West Virginia, to think of a couple off the top of my head. And yet I'm going to expect them to carry a gun and have that liability? Because I promise you, if they end up shooting somebody, you think the school district or the state is going to defend them on their behalf? Probably not. When the family sues everybody, and that including that teacher, he or she is going to be on their own, and that's what I'm talking about. So it's really kind of scary. We have a race to the bottom. We've got a Secretary of Education that does not believe in public education, and I'll just flat out say it. I think it's racially based, and or she's got a class warfare issue, which I'm going to get to in a second. Religion. This thing says, remove the belief in the God from the government. God, that's worded weird. Remove the belief in the God from the government and schools. And again, this is supposed to be Saul Alinsky saying this. If you want to control the people, that's what you do. On that, I say good. I pay taxes here too, man. I live here too. And freedom of religion means I got freedom from it. And to all the religious snowflakes, they like to toss that word around, so I'll say that, who like to blather on about being persecuted in this country, you have no fucking idea what you're talking about. You can go to church And if you don't like the fact that the Ten Commandments can't be displayed on a firehouse lawn, fine. Displayed on the church lawn. I still see it when I drive by. I still see it at your house. You can still do that. We don't have to have the state espouse a government. In fact, the word creator is named 4 times between the 3 founding documents of this country. Between the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights, the word creator is mentioned 4 times. Creator. Not Jesus, not Allah, not Moses, not Buddha, not Muhammad, nothing. Creator, okay? And why is that? Because the Founding Fathers wanted to leave it neutral enough because they had just escaped a monarchy, and they didn't want to have to deal with that again. So you can have freedom of religion, but they weren't going to legislate on it. I mean, people make this mistake. They think it's Jesus and the 12 apostles and the Founding Fathers. It's not. Read quotes by Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, George Washington. None of these guys had a real use for religion at all, but they believed that it was good for the people to have it as they saw fit, which is why it's in there. But and I've never seen an institution that creates, frankly, more war, more death than religion. I mean, one could argue that the communists were every bit as busy. The Chinese and the Russians in their heyday killed a lot of people. I think that's just a benefit also of mass psychology, which religion does do. And basically, if you can't prove it, I don't want to legislate on it. I'm an American citizen. I pay taxes here too. If we're legislating on things, I want to legislate on things I can see. I want to legislate on murder, legislate on stealing, legislate on taxes, things that we can actually see. And by the way, to the Christians that are listening to this, because I know this country considers itself a Christian nation, we're not a Christian nation. Newsflash. We have a secular government. We are not a theocracy here. We're not Iran. We're not Saudi Arabia. We are the United States of America, and people have rights here. And if Jesus was real, you people would behave better. I've never seen a group of people in this country behave more abominably than the so-called Christian. If you're a child of God, act like it. And you don't. You whine about your rights. You whine about being persecuted. You whine that they're going after Trump like he's suddenly some born-again guy who needs to be forgiven. I mean, come on. It's hilarious. It's hilarious what you're willing to forgive. And you want to say, well, Jesus forgives. Yeah, well, you didn't forgive Obama. And he was the Black Reagan. Y'all should have loved him. He did exactly what Ronald Reagan would have done on every front. He didn't keep a single promise of his 2008 campaign. Not one. Got us out of Iraq for a minute, and then we got right back in it. Let's get back to my little points here and start wrapping this up for y'all. Class warfare. Divide the people into the wealthy and the poor. This will cause more discontent, and it will be easier to tax the wealthy with the support of the poor. Okay, well, this is interesting because this stems from a lack of education. To not take or redistribute wealth. But again, why should Apple or IBM pay 0.001%, 0.005% in taxes and not have jobs here? We're not creating jobs. If we did, the problem would be solved. The richest country in history, and we can't hire working people to rebuild infrastructure? I mean, we haven't had a president with a jobs program since Franklin Roosevelt. And he basically had a job for everybody who wanted a job. We had bridges that needed building. We had to do Mount Rushmore. We had to do roads. We're developing the interstates. There was jobs to be had, and towns were created. Entire towns were created out of whole cloth because of the factories that were needed to build or to manufacture steel, process lumber, and everything else that we needed to build infrastructure. So you're expanding business in this country. You're giving jobs to people in this country. Now what we've done is we blame people for being poor. Somebody wants $15 an hour working at McDonald's, which is basically barely a living wage, but we're going to begrudge that guy just because he wants to make a living wage. Maybe he's in school. People say, well, that's not a career. How many careers do you know of that are making $15 an hour? Those jobs are not designed to be a career. They're designed to be jobs, and we're not even doing that right now. So, that's the thing that really just kind of drives me a little bananas with this. And so as this thing wraps up, it says, does any of this sound like it's happening in the United States? Well, yeah, it does, but not the way you want to say it. And Saul Alinsky never said any of these things. That's why I'm having a good time tearing this crap apart. And it finishes up with, the useful idiots have destroyed every nation in which they have seized power and control. It is presently happening at an alarming rate in the United States. it is difficult to free fools from the chains they revere. Well, you know who else is democratic socialist in this world? Australia, Japan, Germany, France, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Switzerland, England, a ton of countries, and it seems to work. And it seems to work because when you have working people buying things and they're able to afford it, then you start to move into a life economy versus a death economy. And this is what we've been doing in the third world for years and years and years. Listen, Russia's been getting demonized and everything else. I'm not a fan of Putin. I know who he is. I know his history. I know what he's done. But I also know what our last 5 presidents at minimum have done. I also know that for a fact we have overthrown 80 elections or interfered in 80 elections in the last 70 years since the advent of the CIA. We dismantled and or deposed 6 sitting leaders, for really, really sinister reasons when you dig deep into what actually happened and not what the news told you. And I'll spend time with some guests, spending an hour on each country. Excuse me, because I can go on, for example, about David Frum on the axis of evil for an hour. Iran, Iraq, North Korea, and talk about perspective. They call the Vietnam War in Vietnam the American War, not the Vietnam War. We illegally invaded that country and killed 1 million of theirs and lost 60,000 of ours. And that's just, meanwhile, Russia doesn't have any bases anywhere else in the world. They're in Syria right now because we dragged them into it. Their defense budget is $65 billion a year, basically maintaining their nukes, which they have, by the way. So if you want to listen to MSNBC or Sean Hannity or whoever talk about saber-rattling a nuclear superpower, that's kind of stupid. But $65 billion in defense, the GDP of Spain and South Korea is what Russia has. China spends about $150 billion on their defense. Same deal, maintaining nukes, hiring an army. Why can they do it so cheap? Volume. But no, seriously, why do they do it so inexpensively? Because they don't have bases all over the world. And by the way, China's the number 2 GDP in the world behind us at $11.2 trillion. And by the way, both those countries have single-payer health care. So there's a little bit of a clue for you. Meanwhile, we have 1,200 bases that we know of. I'm not talking about the covert stuff, just the ones that we know of all over the world, spending $1.3 trillion. And that's when you factor in the VA, the nuclear program, and all the covert operations that we're doing. That costs a lot of money. And no one asks why do we still have bases in Japan? Why do we still have bases in Germany? Why do we still have bases in Italy? If the Germans had a base here in Austin, Texas, Americans would lose their mind. If the Japanese had a base in LA, where I was born and raised, Californians lose their mind. But we do it without any question. The thing I was talking about before, as I wrap up, I want to just kind of wrap up on a couple points here. Medicare for all. Again, the estimates are $50 to $70 billion a year, not counting the 20% increase that I suggested. So if you threw that in, it would be a lot less. And what would you rather have? A $3,000 to $8,000 a year contribution with 5 and 6 figure copays, or about $1,000 a year, give or take, and have everything that you need medically. My mother has Medicare. Most of your parents and grandparents have Medicare. It works. She never gets denied. She gets her prescriptions. She gets her MRIs. Whatever she needs, it works. Business is saving millions of dollars. And that's just kind of the tip of the iceberg here. But I really wanted to tear apart this anonymous article because it ends up at the end of the day being an anonymous article by a guy who just basically doesn't like socialism. So he made something up that a guy who is a pretty important person in history, he never said. But this guy was a useful idiot in his own way and gave me 8 points to talk about tonight. So that being said, guys, if you're on the website and you want to subscribe or you want to get yourself some merchandise, feel free and always reach out, knock in an email. And as always, folks, if this stuff makes you uncomfortable, it's supposed to. Sleep tight.